Okay, so like I was talking about, I'm going to run through a couple of things on the GKE On-Prem side of things. I think out of the whole Anthos stack, I think the two components that are kind of needing to be demystified are the on-prem side of it and the config management side of it. So it fits kind of well with the demo set that we'll do today and kind of diving into this. We called this a deep dive, but quite frankly, a half hour is not really enough time to do a real deep dive. So I'll try to talk about all the components that I know are sort of like the parts that need to be demystified. And then, you know, to Kyle's point, we've got lots of capability to handle things ad hoc. So if you have questions, throw up a hand and I can answer questions. We can dive into something in the lab environment we have up and running as well. Kyle was mentioning kind of a late night last night as per normal. So we're going to live demo because I didn't have time to record anything last night either. So we're going to hopefully have successful demos. It's always a risk, but at the same time, you know, risk reward kind of factor. So hopefully all things work out properly. So GKE On-Prem, the idea behind Anthos in general was Kyle laid out sort of this story around true multi-cloud, hybrid cloud, whatever we want to call it. I like the term multi-cloud better than hybrid cloud because at the end of the day, how you pick and choose it really depends on the use case. We've seen all kinds of different use cases that tend to be on-prem focused versus cloud focused, and then vice versa. You want to scale into on-prem or you want to scale into cloud. Either way, the whole mentality around having something to scale and scale on demand. And so we can talk about some further use cases around how we do this on demand in an automated way, all that sort of stuff. This particular chat will be a little bit more focused on just GKE On-Prem and kind of what it is and how it works. You know, ultimately, the whole idea behind it, and Kyle made mention of the whole orchestrated piece of GKE On-Prem. At the end of the day, GKE On-Prem has been built to deliver a common experience. And so that's pretty tough to do between cloud and, you know, private data center, delivering a common experience. And when we get into the demo, I'll showcase that a little bit more in terms of how far we can take that common experience. But we're in pretty good shape in terms of being able to actually have that common experience. And the idea is GKE On-Prem is, you know, going to take some time to completely get feature set parity with what GKE Cloud is. But at the same time, what we really care about is making sure that as a developer, the way you work with it shouldn't change. And that's sort of the core tenet behind it. And so when we talk through GKE On-Prem and some of the decisions that have been made around things like VMware as an example. So, you know, today the platform of choice for GKE On-Prem, the only deployable option is a VMware stack underneath. And you look at it and it's like, gosh, it'd be awfully nice to pick and choose of the, you know, different hypervisors, bare metal, everything, every choice that's out there. The reality of it is if you take a stance in an orchestrated way and say, we're going to build an experience and we're going to deliver an experience that says, build me a cluster and I want that cluster inside of 10 minutes. You're not going to get that if you immediately go to market with every single choice out there. So suffice it to say, it's a VMware stack today, and we'll drive through some of the other components around it and dive a little bit into the architecture. For the most part, I can take you through some of the actual environment. It's not terribly exciting. Everybody's seen VMware. So I don't think I need to really belabor the vCenter console. It's not that exciting. At the same time, we can go through sort of the components. And I want to focus a little bit on two sort of core components, which are really around network and storage. And that's where most of the questions come from is, you know, how are we going to handle that? I mean, GCP and GKE, every other three-letter acronym, effectively, it's easy to conceptualize how that all comes together because you're in ultimate control. You know, when you talk about cloud, control all components around it. How do you deliver that same experience on-prem is kind of what we're gonna get at. The idea here too is the easy upgrade path. So right now we've seen over the early access releases through alpha, through the beta phases, and now what hit last week, which is the full GA version of GKE On-Prem. Through each of those releases, the Kubernetes control plane has been upgraded through all of it as well. And so the mentality of it is, again, similar to how you deliver GKE clusters, you're delivering those same clusters on-prem essentially through what GKE On-Prem calls user clusters. And we'll kind of walk through that. I can show you an example and what we'll run in a later demo. I'll show you that one live as well. And the idea of the third bullet point here is we've got a couple of different options in terms of integration point. Some of what's available to GCP Cloud today, things like Cloud Build, GCR, all that sort of stuff, that's got some native integration. And we'll talk about some of the other components that maybe we've deviated from that a little bit and gone to an on-prem model for things like maybe a registry to be on-prem. Because, you know, commonly we've got, you know, an Artifactory or something like that that's on-prem. All of that out of the box today works. We've done implementations in sort of different variations of enterprise registry, cloud registry, that sort of stuff. It's pretty flexible in that sense. So we'll dive a little bit into that. One of the most common questions and the things that we need to demystify quite a bit is, what does this thing need for connectivity into the cloud, right? Like, one of the biggest questions that comes up is, if you're going to deliver an experience on-prem, how does that translate to what my cloud experience is, what my GCP experience is? And ultimately, all this means is we need a single connection to make that experience happen. And that single connection is a purposeful connection. It doesn't do everything. It's not like it's opening up a proxy for the rest of the world to access your data center. No traffic flows through here. It's simply a management control point. That's it, okay? And all it is it's two components, and we'll kind of depict it here with this GKE Connect proxy and then the GKE Connect agent. The important part of this is the only connection required really is an outbound connection from that GKE Connect agent, which is nothing more than a pod running inside a GKE on-prem. And all it does is connect up into GCP and make that connection. What that does for you is ultimately give you the visibility and the experience that you get from a GKE cloud standpoint for on-prem clusters. So I'll show you that in the demo as well, kind of how that comes together. The important part to demystify in this is that it's an outbound connection. So we've had some scenarios where we've had to run through a proxy, which is pretty common in enterprise, right? That all works. It's not terribly intrusive because it's an outbound connection. So as long as we can get proxy details, authentication, that sort of stuff, we can make the connection up to GCP and ultimately deliver that experience. What comes from that is things like, and what some of the goals start to look like are things like marketplace deployments to hybrid cloud. That's a pretty cool concept. And that's some of the areas where things are starting to mature a little bit. Mostly what people care about from that experience standpoint is the visibility and the capability to understand kind of what's going on in that multi-cloud or hybrid cloud experience. And ultimately that's how it's delivered. Pretty straightforward. And one of the other important notes here, this isn't for any other call outbound. This isn't all of a sudden the magic pipe that's going to get you to make API calls to GCP as an example. It is strictly for the cluster to register and make itself available to your GCP console. And we'll go through that a little bit. Networking is the other part that generally needs some demystification, in the sense that, I was talking about the GCP experience, or GKE experience in the cloud is everything's kind of built. It's everything's already there. I can do storage, I can do load balancing, I can do all the network components, all that sort of stuff. The prime difference in the GKE on-prem space is I need a way to orchestrate network change. And ultimately, the way that's been delivered in GKE on-prem is a native integration with F5. It's similar to the VMware choice. F5 is kind of the lion's share of the load balancer / they like to call it ADC, load balancer. And the idea is they're kind of kings, right? They've got a good market hold in terms of that particular part of the market. And so ultimately, it makes sense to make that the first choice in terms of integration. Are there other options coming and available today? Yes. So the two options today, not really depicted on this slide, is what we can do is we can actually disconnect the F5 requirement and effectively deliver a bring your own load balancer experience. The downside is, to be perfectly clear, as soon as we disconnect the F5 piece today and introduce the bring your own load balancer, that kind of puts a network team or ops team into critical path for building out of clusters from a GKE on-prem standpoint, because all of a sudden now I can't have it automatically orchestrate. I've got to go make some changes at the load balancer level and then go stand up clusters. So it does break a little bit of that experience, right? And it is different from GCP. I mean, if you stand up a GKE cluster today, put a load balancer type service in place, GCP takes care of a bunch of that orchestration, giving you the experience of basically a click and I've got a cluster. This is delivered natively with GKE on-prem through an integration, kind of a two-sided integration. So the first part of the integration is F5 has been pretty prominent in the container space over the last couple of years. And mostly their endeavor is to help gain visibility into things like pod workloads and all that sort of stuff. And at the same time, deliver the common experience that the network and security teams are used to from an F5 perspective. That doesn't change in this deployment model. And so what Google's done from an integration standpoint is leverage a piece of code that F5 has developed. It's open source. It's called F5 Container Connector. And F5 Container Connector is all about basically you putting configurations from a Kubernetes standpoint inside of your cluster, and F5 Container Connector picking up those changes and effectively making them so on the F5. So ultimately, the similar thing to what we're doing with vCenter to build out virtual machines for GKE On-Prem to run, Container Connector is doing the orchestration to the F5. The reason I say it's kind of a co-developed scenario is what Container Connector can't natively do is take, when you create a service and say, I want that to be a load balancer service, Container Connector doesn't know how to do something with that because it doesn't have the config yet. So the part that Google shored up in the configuration from an F5 standpoint is they've written an operator in Kubernetes that essentially watches for configuration changes at the service level. So as an operator or a developer, you go in and create a load balancer type service. As soon as you create a load balancer type service, Google's operator picks up on that change, writes out the configuration that F5 and Container Connector need to go make the changes upstream. All of that happens within a matter of a fraction of a second. So effectively, operator takes note of a load balancer type service. The idea behind that whole orchestration is to make sure that I can create a load balancer type service and effectively have that plumbed upstream in the F5 and gain access to services like I would in GKE. Works no different. I mean, in GKE, we've got node ports across the entire cluster. You've got Google load balancing in front of that to take care of the load balancing to the node ports. No different here. It's exactly the same experience. And that's a huge win. And so when Kyle talked about things like the Optiva use case, we've done another one recently. In terms of code changes, it's really nothing required to change things. If you've got things running in Kubernetes, it will run in GKE On-Prem. It will run in GKE. So part of that experience is to deliver a true native Kubernetes experience without a whole lot of deviation and a whole lot of modifications to get things to run. And so when we talk about things like load balancer integration and being able to get that experience, when we're talking about the changes required, there may be 1 or 2 lines required to be changed in a Helm chart just to change the load balancer type service or something like that. But ultimately, that's the end of the change. So in terms of seamless experience and parity, it's pretty good, right? We get the ability to kind of run either or. From a pure network perspective, some of the stuff that's changing a little bit, and we've kind of got eventually Istio in there. We're going to show you today that it's not really eventually Istio, it is Istio. So part of what Google's done from an ingress standpoint, the ingress that ships with GKE On-Prem is an Istio-based ingress. What that means is, from a developer experience, again, it's just managing ingress objects. You don't actually have to onboard into Istio. It just happens to be the ingress. You've got options to pick your own ingress, same as you do in GKE, so none of that experience changes, but ultimately you get kind of choice. What we're going to show you this afternoon, Paul and I are going to show you a demo with Istio natively running. So an actual full Istio service mesh with Envoy proxies, everything across GKE On-Prem and GKE. And the idea is that sort of seamless experience. That's prime focus for it. If that idea is not evident enough, that is the prime focus, is really seamless experience. The only other point I wanted to make is network policy is now supported in GKE On-Prem. So it was kind of this, unsupported thing. We were shipping Calico, but kind of unsupported from a network policy standpoint. As of GA, fully supported. So when we look at stacking up the 2 deployments, GKE versus GKE On-Prem, it's same across the board. You've got Calico, network policy, Istio capabilities, load balancer integration across both. We're starting to get to what is the utopian dream of true multi-cloud and not having to worry so much about where we're deployed. From an orchestration standpoint, when it comes to storage, and Aaron and Chris are going to talk a little bit more about some other storage options. Just like everything else, there are options. GKE is no different. So in GKE, we have some options in terms of what storage we can deliver to the cluster. There's some native integrations, so things like delivering block devices. There's some file store integration, that sort of stuff. But then there's also some further integration, and that's kind of what the guys are going to go through on the GKE On-Prem side. How GKE On-Prem ships today is with a vSphere storage provider. So similar to the F5 integration, we have to pick a horse when it comes to storage. We have to pick a horse when it comes to network in order to deliver that orchestrated experience. Obviously, we're deploying GKE On-Prem on VMware and vCenter, so it kind of makes sense to have that first choice for storage be vSphere storage provider. Out of the box, GKE On-Prem, I request persistent storage. I'm going to get VMDKs that are built, orchestrated by the cluster, attached to my nodes, similar to the GKE experience. Really no difference. All of this is controlled through a connection to vCenter. So it's critical to have a vCenter configuration. I really don't know anybody running VMware at scale without vCenter, so that's usually not a problem. To be perfectly honest, usually the stumbling point is getting access to the credentials in order to do that. right? Sometimes that's a difficult wall to jump over, is the whole, well, now I need just a username and password into vCenter that's going to allow me to create my own virtual machines. Usually that's a little bit of a boundary, but that's outside of the technology stack, in the sense that the technology stack works, it's built to do this. And I'll dive into a demo and I'll show you kind of how that's orchestrated. But part of the design goal around GKE On-Prem is it's all in-band management, in the sense that it's clusters built off of clusters. So everything is orchestrated at the Kubernetes level. It's not this magical orchestrator that sits on top and then, you know, manages all of these clusters. It is Kubernetes managing Kubernetes. So basically, when we start with an implementation like that, you know, sort of week by week implementation sort of plan, the idea is that when we run through that implementation, we're bootstrapping the first cluster, the first admin cluster inside of an environment. Once that's done, we can spin up user clusters at free will, and those are built off of that main cluster. And so the idea is that we're not introducing some other control plane, it's Kubernetes. And what that does for you is deliver very much that same experience that you get in GKE from a cloud standpoint. When I'm a developer and I fire up a cluster in GKE, I don't see masters. I don't manage anything. All I see is the nodes that I'm actually going to run workloads on. That's no different in GKE On-Prem. Logging and monitoring has been a hot topic as well. Especially when we talk about things like data residency and all that good stuff. Part of the use case of GKE On-Prem is to tackle some of those data residency challenges. You know, I might not be perfectly comfortable with every region that GCP can be leveraged for today, or GKE can be deployed in. GKE On-Prem solves a bit of that use case, but then there's another sort of story to that, which is how do I gain visibility and that sort of stuff. So natively, GKE On-Prem ships with a Prometheus monitoring stack, works pretty well. It's out of the box. The idea is that's your sort of, you know, metrics and visibility in terms of the health of your cluster. Obviously, it's got to get layered in with some operational things, typically around vCenter. I mean, most people want to wrap some of the typical things they do from a monitoring standpoint in vCenter to help kind of, you know, manage and maintain it. Prometheus stack is deployed natively and works. The other options here are things like an EFK stack for local logging support. As of GA last week, the default deployment model for GKE On-Prem also comes with Stackdriver integration. So the idea here is to deliver the same experience we have from a GKE standpoint in Stackdriver for On-Prem. That delivers to you is the ability to log into Stackdriver and see logs from not only your GKE clusters, but your On-Prem cluster. So that works today. That's a separate connection from that Connect Hub connection that I walked you through earlier. So it is important to note that it is another connection, can be proxied as well, but it's also optional. So if you're not comfortable sending your logs into Stackdriver, you shut it off. Sam's going to go through some alternative options around Sysdig delivers in that space as well. This is just speaking to GKE On-Prem deploys natively. And most of that works pretty well. I mean, what we're talking about today, for the most part, with Stackdriver is, you know, system-based logs and things like that. There's a bunch of work being done in terms of getting better Stackdriver metrics capabilities and things like that at the application level. So one thing I want to do for you guys is dive into a little bit of a demo and kind of show you what GKE On-Prem looks like to help with sort of the demystification, because it's been kind of kept pretty private, specific in terms of release and who has access to it and all that sort of stuff. And the idea is to make sure that everybody's getting a good experience out of that first release too. So the last thing you want to do is release something that's pretty early and fresh out to the open market and then have a bunch of bad experiences and all that sort of stuff. And that's, you know, kind of where our role sort of helps as well. Let's test the demo gods. I promised I wasn't going to belabor the whole vCenter story, because everybody has seen vCenter. It's not terribly exciting. GKE On-Prem doesn't make it any more exciting. It's still vCenter, it's still VMware. But the idea is that overall, just to lay out sort of kind of how this comes together, the two components I wanted to talk about are this concept of an admin cluster and the concept of what is my user cluster. And to talk a little bit about architecture, I talked about the fact that we're going to build clusters off of clusters. And I'll show you in a real way. But the idea is that the first thing we're going to bootstrap when we stand up GKE On-Prem is what's called the admin cluster. This is effectively the control plane that GKE manages for you and you never see. But obviously in an on-prem fashion, we have to see it. It has to be there. It has to be present. We have to be able to use it. And the idea is this admin cluster is sort of your operational gate point. This is also where you build additional what's called user clusters. Your user clusters are where you're going to do the real work. And down here is my user cluster. I've got what is designated as a 5-node user cluster, in addition to one extra node here that is termed as a control VM or a control node from a user cluster standpoint. Effectively, that is my master for my user cluster. Still, as a developer, as a user, I don't see that. So as an example, as I build user clusters, I build this one here, and I issue, kubeconfigs or OIDC login or whatever in terms of getting people access to it, they never see that control VM. The only folks that will see that control VM are operations. That's it, and completely by design. So the idea is that as a normal user, I can't torch my own cluster. I can't do silly things. And that's part of the experience. That's what GKE has done really well. So part of what GKE did really well out of the box is this, click in the console, give me a cluster, get access to the cluster. Now I run workloads, and I don't have to worry about screwing it up. I'm going to deliver a 5-node cluster here. And that's, really it from a vCenter standpoint. And again, kind of why I didn't want to belabor the whole, what the vCenter experience looks like. What this ends up doing for you from a timing standpoint, to bootstrap admin cluster and a user cluster right now is about a half-hour process, which isn't too bad considering we're actually building VMs comparatively to cloud that master plane is already done for you. So it's about a half-hour experience. The standing up of a user cluster after the fact is generally anywhere from 5 to 10, which is, again, pretty good from an on-prem experience. If anybody here has tried to build out their own Kubernetes clusters, knows that that's pretty impressive. And so the idea is this is admin cluster handling all the orchestration. So we got to get it some credentials. We got to get it some vCenter credentials. We got to get it big IP credentials to do the network orchestration. We give it the right credentials, the right access, and let it run kind of wild. I'll show you real quick here some of the components before I hand it over to Chris and Aaron. So the two things that I wanted to show you, we were talking a little bit about that common sort of experience. What I wanted to show you here is from a GCP console standpoint. The idea behind GKE On-Prem in general, apologies for the clutter. This is Arctiq testing. So we got lots of clusters in here, and we've been doing lots of iterative testing on this stuff. But mostly what I wanted to kind of highlight is for the demos today, the two clusters that we're going to work with are what's deemed here Hipster Remote. I'll explain that after. But Hipster Remote is a GKE cluster. We can see its location is North America, Northeast 1 in Zone A. We can see it's a 3-node cluster, 6 vCPUs, and 22 gig somewhat of memory. Nothing different than what we normally do with GKE. The difference is up top here we have my user cluster that we saw in the vCenter console as well. And the idea is this shows up, location is registered. The idea is this is an on-prem cluster. And we can see the tag, the label across the right-hand side, provider is GKE On-Prem. This is about what that Connect agent delivers in terms of experience. The idea being is from a GCP console perspective, from a visibility perspective, I gain access to both. And I don't care anymore where things are running. But the idea here is we're seeing my 5-node user cluster. We're seeing 20 CPUs, all the memory that's attached to them. If I click into here, there's a couple of things that I can see. I can see all of the storage that's attached to it. So here's some of the persistent volumes that are attached to it. vSphere, VMDK is across the board. I can see some of the information that I would normally see from a persistent volume claim perspective. So attaching it to the actual claims itself. So explaining kind of what some of these components are doing. So we can see some stuff related to the Prometheus stack I was talking about, as well as Stackdriver and Grafana and alerting. But then more importantly, and what most people are kind of curious and interested in, is this idea of being able to see those same vCenter managed nodes in this console, similar to how I see everything in GKE. So the whole idea is, mostly this is kind of abstracted. Obviously, these are VMs, so I can't really do much with them from a management perspective from this console. That's still primarily farmed to the actual on-prem deployment itself, but the visibility is there. And more importantly, what more people are concerned with from this standpoint, and I'll click through a couple of areas just so you can kind of see how this looks. We can see the pods running on the nodes, same as we can in GKE, so none of this is different in terms of experience. But what more people are kind of interested in right out of the gate are things like workload visibility. So let's ignore all the other clusters that we've built and haven't logged into, and do things like filtering workloads based off a cluster. So I can sit here and go, I want to see what's running in my on-prem cluster as an example. And in particular, I only care about one namespace And I think, Sam, you're using the same app for your demo. So there'll be a bit of accidental consistency. So that's fine. But the idea is I can drive in and I can see the workloads running in my on-prem cluster the same as I can in my GKE cluster, which becomes super powerful from just, again, that sort of user experience, the visibility side of it, things that I can orchestrate with it. And again, this is sort of the first foray into what is a true hybrid or multi-cloud visibility point. And so it only gets better from here, right? In terms of feature set and functionality, things getting layered in and added to this. This is sort of first wave, and in our opinion, kind of a pretty good first wave. Similarly, if I want to look at things that are running in another cluster, so if I wanted to say, I want to see things running in the same namespace across 2 different clusters, I can see this here. Same for things like services and ingress. Similarly to how I was looking at application workloads, I can see services and network information across multiple clusters. Multiple clusters, multiple namespaces. I can see the health of them. I can see the type of service they are. The two look no different between GKE and GKE On-Prem. And that's ultimately the real sort of story around GKE On-Prem and what it offers. It shouldn't be any more exciting. If it is, I think we're doing things wrong. And to Kyle's point around like things like Knative and Cloud Run, the whole idea is to abstract beyond what Kubernetes is doing. And so making Kubernetes be the common platform underneath, less and less individual interaction with Kubernetes itself is really where things are headed. If we can deliver a Kubernetes experience seamlessly across multiple providers, now we've solved for the whole idea of I don't need to carry and feed for Kubernetes clusters in a specific way based off of where they're deployed. I just get to have Kubernetes. Now I get to layer stuff in over top. And that's kind of the idea. One last thing I'll show you just from a super deep dive tech standpoint is if we go, I just wanted to give you a comparison here between these 2 things. And actually, let me declutter that a little bit. So this is my on-prem cluster, similar to what we saw in GCP console. So it's not like you don't have access to kubectl and all the tools the developers are comfortable with. It's nothing more than another Kubernetes cluster. It's nothing more than same thing as sort of GKE delivers in that side of things. I interact with it, the same tools that I use. And we'll show that a little bit this afternoon as well. If I go over to the cloud version of this, no different. Different versions of Kubernetes for those that noticed. But other than that, no different. Thanks for listening to me yammer on about GKE On-Prem. It's been fun to work with, I'll tell you that. It's been interesting to see this product kind of, come to life into what is now, as you see, sort of a seamless experience across both. We're going to use the same set of clusters for our Istio demo this afternoon. So we'll show a little bit more about how we've sort of made the experience even further seamless. Thanks, guys.